Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to dive right into one of the oldest and honestly most fundamental debates in all of criminology. Who actually gets to define our criminal laws today? It's a huge question. It literally sits at the very foundation of how our modern society operates, but, we rarely ever pause to actually think about it.
So, I want you to ask yourself a surprisingly complex question right off the bat. Who actually decides what counts as a crime? Now, the law seems like the obvious answer, right? But the moment you look at exactly why the law says what it says, you uncover two completely opposing perspectives. And getting a grip on both of these views is absolutely crucial if we want to make sense of the justice system that we interact with every single day.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. First, we'll look at the comforting consensus view. Then, we'll switch gears to the disruptive critical perspective. And finally, we'll put them head to head.
Section 1. The consensus perspective. This is the idea of the law as our shared morality.
So this approach relies on what academics call the normative perspective. It basically assumes that despite all of our everyday differences, whether it's politics, religion, or our general backgrounds, most people in a community actually share the exact same core values about what constitutes harm. Think about it: murder, theft, assault. The normative perspective argues that practically nobody is out there arguing that these things shouldn't be punished. In this view, society is a relatively unified entity, and the law, well, it simply mirrors that unity.
Criminologist Larry Siegel really hits the nail on the head here, arguing there is absolutely nothing mysterious going on behind the scenes. If the law prohibits a behavior and you did it intentionally, well, it's a crime. The idea here is that laws aren't just imposed on society from some higher-up power. Rather, they are society's very own values written down and backed up by the force of punishment. It's essentially the idea that our legal code is just a formalized, written version of our collective conscience.
Now, this comforting perspective actually traces all the way back to the philosopher John Locke and his really famous social contract theory. It's this concept that we all voluntarily trade away a little portion of our absolute individual freedom in exchange for the organized protection that living in a society provides. Under this theory, citizens collaborate to build a legal system aimed at shared goals, protecting life, property, and public order. We willingly give up the right to absolute freedom so that we don't have to live in constant fear. It's a trade-off.
So, the absolute crucial takeaway here is that under this incredibly clean, reassuring picture, the state is acting purely as a neutral enforcer of our shared values. In the consensus view, the criminal law is just a reflection of shared social morality, and the government, they're just the referee, making sure everyone plays by the rules we all already agreed upon. It's a very stable, unified view of the world. But what if that shared moral agreement is actually just an illusion?
Which brings us to Section 2, the critical perspective, or the law as control.
Okay, so the critical view, which is sometimes called the conflict view, completely throws that shared moral agreement idea right out the window. Instead, critical criminologists argue that modern societies today are actually made up of competing groups who have vastly different amounts of wealth, power, and political influence. In this view, the law isn't some neutral reflection of shared values. It is literally a weapon used by the powerful to protect their own dominant position. It's a pretty blunt assessment. Laws are written by the few in order to protect what the few already have.
And there's a really rich intellectual history backing this up. It starts with early theorists who framed crime as a direct product of political inequality. They saw groups actively competing for influence over the legal system itself. Over time, more radical thinkers pushed this idea even further. They argued that the modern justice system functions primarily to protect economic and political power, not to express any kind of warm shared morality. Basically, they argued that whoever holds the structural power essentially gets to define what counts as a crime.
You know the term white-collar crime? Well, that concept perfectly highlights this entire critical perspective. When Edwin Sutherland actually coined the term, he noticed a massive, glaring inconsistency. The legal system was obsessively focused on punishing low-status, street-level offenders, while at the same time largely ignoring the massive, sweeping harms caused by people in high-status corporate jobs. Conflict theorists point straight to this gap and say, look, it's not that powerful people don't cause harm, it's just that the legal system is incredibly slow to label their specific brand of harm as a crime.
Fast forward to today, and modern critical approaches have expanded significantly. They aren't just looking at class and economics anymore. They're analyzing how legal systems reflect structural inequalities across race and gender as well. Some branches, like peacemaking criminology, actually advocate for restorative responses to crime rather than pure punishment. And their reasoning makes a lot of structural sense when you look at it. If your justice system is built on unequal power dynamics to begin with, and all it does is punish harder, well, it's just going to keep reproducing those exact same unequal outcomes generation after generation.
All right, Section 3, comparing the views. Let's put these two lenses on the law side by side.
The contrast between these two philosophies is literally night and day. On one hand, the consensus view sees a highly unified society, where the law reflects genuine shared morality and the state acts merely as a neutral referee. But on the other hand, the critical view sees a society fundamentally divided by class and power, where the law reflects only the interests of the powerful. In that view, the state is an active instrument of the dominant group.
Let's bring this down to earth and see what happens when we apply both lenses to a real-world example today. Take the way drug laws have historically been enforced far more harshly against poorer communities than wealthier ones. A consensus theorist looks at that and argues the law is simply enforcing the moral standards we all agreed upon to maintain public order. But a conflict theorist looks at the exact same law and the exact same enforcement data and sees clear-cut evidence of unequal power being leveraged against marginalized groups. It's wild, right? Applying two competing theories to one concrete case is really the best way to grasp just how fundamentally different these frameworks are. Now, while the consensus and critical views largely dominate this whole debate, there is a third major perspective we are going to explore in the future explainer. It's called the interactionist view. This theory argues that crime isn't fixed by a grand moral consensus, nor is it purely dictated by raw, top-down power. Actually, scratch that whole top-down thing completely. This view suggests that criminal is simply a label applied through everyday social interaction. But we will dive deeply into labeling theory next time.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to really chew on. When you look at the laws governing your life today, whose interests does the law actually protect? Who defines criminal law today, and who really gets to decide? Think critically about the rules around you, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.